He was the warrior who humbled Crusader kings, the sultan who retook Jerusalem, and the legend who showed mercy when he could have chosen vengeance. In an age of betrayal, he stood for honor. In a time of bloodshed, he chose justice. This is the real story, not the one Hollywood told you, but the untold truth behind the Crusades, the fall of Jerusalem, and the rise of Salahuddin Ayyubi, the Lion of Islam. Forget the myths, forget the fiction. This is history as it really happened. Welcome to Kingdom of Heaven, the real history. Long before armies marched under the shadow of the cross or the crescent, before kings and caliphs spilled blood in the name of salvation, there was a city, ancient, sacred and eternal, a city where heaven and earth have always stood dangerously close. That city was Jerusalem. Jerusalem, a city sacred to three faiths. Jerusalem, a place where the divine has always touched the human, where the echoes of prophets linger in the stone and the cries of conquest never fade. To the Jews, Jerusalem was, and remains, the holiest place on earth. It is the city of King David and the site of Solomon's temple, once home to the Ark of the Covenant. In Jewish scripture, it is the eternal capital promised to the people of Israel. To Christians, Jerusalem is the final chapter of Christ's life on earth, the city where Jesus, peace be upon him, was crucified, buried, and according to Christian belief, resurrected. Pilgrimage to this sacred land was seen not just as a spiritual duty, but a journey into the heart of divine history. To Muslims, Jerusalem is Al-Quds, the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. It was in this city that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ arrived during the miraculous Isra and Mi'raj, the night journey, where he led the prophets in prayer and ascended to the heavens. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock still stand as powerful symbols of this miraculous event. One city, three faiths, 1,000 years of devotion, and 1,000 more of conflict. But the importance of Jerusalem was not limited to theology. It was also the jewel of empires, a gateway between East and West, North and South. Control over this city meant not only spiritual authority, but geopolitical dominance. The political map of the Middle East before the Crusades. As the 11th century drew to a close, the Middle East was a chessboard of rival dynasties and fading powers. The once mighty Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, was a shadow of its former glory. Though the Abbasid caliphs still held spiritual authority, they were politically weak, unable to enforce their rule across the sprawling Islamic world. In Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate had established a powerful Shia regime, independent from the Sunni Abbasids. The Fatimids controlled a vast empire that stretched from North Africa to the Levant, and at one point even Jerusalem itself. But by the mid-11th century, a new force had entered the arena, the Seljuk Turks. These Sunni Muslim warriors of Central Asian origin had swept across Persia, Iraq, Syria and Anatolia, forming a vast empire under their great Seljuk Sultan. The Seljuks claimed to protect the Abbasid Caliph while holding real power in their hands. In 1071, they had dealt a crushing blow to the Christian Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert, opening Anatolia to Turkish settlement and Islamic influence. And in 1073, the Seljuks captured Jerusalem from the Fatimids, marking a turning point in the city's destiny. In less than a century, Jerusalem had changed hands between rival Muslim powers. And far away in Europe, rumors of its capture had stirred the hearts of kings, knights and priests. A fractured Muslim world. Though Islam had once united much of the known world under a single banner, from Spain to the Indus, by the late 11th century, that unity had shattered. The Abbasids remained in Baghdad but were largely ceremonial rulers. The Fatimids in Egypt followed a different interpretation of Islam and frequently clashed with their Sunni neighbors. The Seljuks, while Sunni, ruled through a loose confederation of sultans and emirs, often divided by personal ambitions. Smaller dynasties like the Zengids, Artukids, and Buyids filled the regional vacuum with their own rivalries. This disunity meant that while the Muslim world was large, it was politically fragmented and militarily vulnerable. There was no central caliphate strong enough to resist a major external invasion, and the idea of jihad, or holy struggle, had become more of a political slogan than an organized response. The House of Islam was vast, but divided. The fire of unity had dimmed, and the West was watching. A West awakening. The rise of Christian zeal. In Europe, things were changing. After centuries of what historians call the Dark Ages, the Western Christian world was experiencing a cultural and religious revival. The Catholic Church, under the leadership of the Pope in Rome, had grown in power and influence. The concept of Christendom, a united Christian identity, was being forged, but Europe too was divided. Kings and nobles constantly warred over land and inheritance. Knights trained in the art of war often had no battles to fight and no purpose to serve. Meanwhile, pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem brought back tales, some exaggerated, others true, of danger and desecration. Churches defiled, relics stolen, pilgrims attacked, and across the Christian kingdoms one idea began to spread like wildfire. The Holy Land must be reclaimed, not just for Christendom, but for salvation. The spark that ignited the flames. The spark came in 1095 at the Council of Clermont in southern France. There, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon that would change the course of history. He called upon the knights and lords of Christendom to take up the cross and march to the east, to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. Deus vult, he cried. God wills it. The message was electrifying. For nobles, it was a chance for land, title, and wealth. For peasants, it was a divine calling, a promise of forgiveness, glory, and eternal paradise. Entire villages emptied. Families were torn apart. Europe was mobilizing for war, not just any war, but a crusade. By 1096, tens of thousands had begun the journey toward the Holy Land. What followed would be a campaign of unprecedented violence and devotion, and the city of Jerusalem would soon find itself at the center of a storm unlike anything it had witnessed in centuries. In the East, the Muslim world remained divided, distracted by its internal rivalries. In the West, a religious fire had been lit, one that would not be extinguished for centuries. Two worlds, one city, and a war that would shape the course of civilization. The Holy Land was far, but the desire to reclaim it burned fiercely in the hearts of the faithful. In the year 1095, a single voice rose from the West, a call that would echo across kingdoms and centuries, a call that promised salvation and brought war. That voice was Pope Urban II. The Council of Clermont, a speech that changed history. In November of 1095, in the French town of Clermont, a great church council was called by Pope Urban II. The crowd gathered was immense, bishops, nobles, knights and peasants, all eager to hear the Pope's message. The world they lived in was brutal. Feudal Europe was a patchwork of warring territories, raiding lords, and lawless violence. Knights, trained killers in armor, had few wars left to fight, and often turned their swords on each other or the innocent. But Urban had a vision, a way to channel this violence toward a divine purpose. Standing on an open-air platform with his voice echoing into history, Urban made his fateful call. A grave report has come from the East, that an accursed race has violently invaded the lands of our brothers and has depopulated them by pillage and fire. They have destroyed the churches. They desecrate the altars. They torture the faithful. Whether these claims were fully true or not didn't matter. The effect on the audience was electric. Urban continued, "Let none hesitate. Take the cross. Go forth, warriors of Christ. Your sins will be washed away. Paradise will be your reward, and Jerusalem your mission." Then came the cry that would define an era. Deus vult, God wills it. With those words, Europe was set ablaze. A holy war had been declared, and an army of pilgrims, warriors, beggars, nobles, and peasants would soon be born. Why they fought? Faith, glory, and greed. The Pope's message was both spiritual and strategic. The official reason: to aid the Byzantine Empire against Turkish forces and to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. But beneath the surface, many motivations stirred in the hearts of crusaders. 1. Religious zeal. For some, this was pure faith. The crusade was a pilgrimage with the sword, a way to fight for Christ and earn redemption. Urban had promised complete remission of sins for all who joined, the ultimate incentive for men burdened with guilt. 2. Social and political escape. For landless knights and younger sons with no inheritance, this was an opportunity to gain land, wealth, and title in the East. The East was imagined as a land flowing with riches, exotic cities, and divine promise. 3. Violence redirected. Many warriors were tired of endless feudal war. The Church had tried and failed to impose God's peace. The crusade offered them a cause to fight, with honor, purpose, and eternal reward. 4. Economic gain. Merchants saw an opportunity to open new trade routes. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa would later profit immensely from transporting men and supplies eastward. To some, it was salvation. To others, conquest. But to all, it was war. Who answered the call? The First Crusade was unlike any military campaign before it. It wasn't organized by a king or a professional army, but by faith, fury, and fire. A mass movement of faith. Tens of thousands responded. Nobles sold off land, castles, and even their wives' jewelry to fund their journey. Knights stitched red crosses onto their cloaks, a sign that they had taken the cross. Even peasants and children joined the cause, believing they too could walk to glory. This was not one army, it was many. A holy horde, bound not by discipline, but by dream. The leaders of the First Crusade. Though there was no single leader, several powerful lords would emerge as commanders of the First Crusade. Raymond IV of Toulouse, one of the most respected and pious leaders. Godfrey of Bouillon, a Frankish knight who would later become defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman warrior with ambitions of carving out his own principality. Tancred, his fiery nephew, famed for his courage. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother who would later become the first king of Jerusalem. But along with them came less disciplined mobs, including Peter the Hermit, a wild preacher who led thousands of poor men, women, and children eastward, a tragic and chaotic force known as the People's Crusade. The road to Jerusalem begins. In 1096, the First Crusaders began their march, not just from France, but from Germany, Italy, and England. Many had never left their villages. They spoke different languages. They came from different cultures. But they were all marching to the same destination, Jerusalem, over 3,000 kilometers away. They passed through Eastern Europe, then into the Byzantine Empire, where tensions rose. The Emperor Alexios I welcomed them, but warily. He had asked for help, not an invasion of armed mobs. The Crusaders had come as saviors, but many would soon act as conquerors. The People's Crusade, faith meets tragedy. Led by Peter the Hermit, the People's Crusade moved fast but recklessly. Tens of thousands of poorly armed peasants crossed into Turkish territory without coordination. In Anatolia, near Nicaea, they were ambushed by Seljuk forces. Most were slaughtered. The dream of a quick liberation died in the dust of Turkish arrows. But the real Crusader armies, better trained and equipped, were still coming. Europe was on the move. The sword had been blessed, and the armies of Christ would stop at nothing to seize the gates of heaven. The East reacts, the Muslim world caught unaware. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, there was no united response. The Seljuks were embroiled in their own civil wars. The Fatimids in Egypt had only recently lost Jerusalem. There was no caliph leading a defense, no great general to resist. Muslims viewed the Crusaders at first not as a divine threat, but as just another group of foreign invaders, like the Byzantines before them. Few could have guessed that this invasion would last for nearly 200 years and reshape the fate of Islam and the West forever. What began as a sermon in a quiet French town had now become a storm. A mass migration of men with swords, crosses, and holy fire in their hearts. They were coming not for trade, not for peace, but for salvation through conquest. They came as pilgrims, they marched as warriors, and now they were conquerors. After years of blood, hunger, and unimaginable sacrifice, the Crusaders had reached the city of their dreams, Jerusalem. But what followed was not salvation, it was slaughter. The road to Jerusalem, battles that shaped a crusade. The First Crusade was never a straight march. It was a brutal journey, filled with sieges, starvation, and survival against the odds. Siege of Nicaea, 1097. After the disaster of the People's Crusade, the real Crusader armies arrived in Anatolia. Their first major test came at Nicaea, a city held by the Seljuk Turks. With support from the Byzantine army, the Crusaders laid siege. After weeks of fighting, Nicaea surrendered, not to the Crusaders, but directly to the Byzantines. Tensions grew. The Crusaders felt cheated. The Byzantines feared their allies might become conquerors. The Battle of Dorylaeum, 1097. In July, the Crusaders marched deeper into Asia Minor, hot, mountainous, and hostile. Suddenly, they were ambushed by a massive Seljuk force led by Kilij Arslan. For hours, the Crusader vanguard was surrounded, but then the rest of the army arrived, smashing into the Turks' flanks. The Seljuks were routed, and the road to Syria opened. It was not the strength of one army, but the fury of many. The Great Siege of Antioch, 1097-1098. If Jerusalem was the soul of the Crusade, Antioch was its test of survival. A massive city, protected by huge walls and a mountaintop citadel. Too large to surround, too strong to storm. The siege dragged on for 8 horrific months. Starvation, disease, and despair. Crusaders ate horses, leather, and grass. Some were accused of cannibalism. Morale collapsed. Many deserted. But then hope came from within. A traitor, Firuz, a tower guard, agreed to open a gate. In June 1098, the Crusaders stormed the city in a surprise night attack. They had taken Antioch, but the very next day, they were trapped inside by a new Muslim army led by Kerboga of Mosul. The miracle of the Holy Lance? Hope seemed lost, until a strange event changed everything. A priest named Peter Bartholomew claimed he had a vision from St. Andrew. The Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ, was buried beneath a church in Antioch. They dug and found it. Whether real or not, it revived Crusader morale. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders charged out of the city. Despite being outnumbered, they crushed Kerboga's army. Was it divine intervention or desperation disguised as faith? Either way, it worked. The fall of Edessa, a new Latin state. Before reaching Jerusalem, some Crusaders diverted to create their own Christian rule. Baldwin of Boulogne, brother of Godfrey, moved east. Through alliances, betrayal, and ambition, he took control of Edessa, a strategic city. It became the first Crusader state, the County of Edessa. The crusade was no longer just about Jerusalem. It was about territory, power, kingdoms. Jerusalem at last, the city of God. Finally, in June 1099, after nearly 4 years, the Crusaders reached their goal. Jerusalem, sacred, shining, and ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. The city was heavily fortified, water was scarce, supplies were low, but the Crusaders were driven not by comfort, but conviction. The siege begins. The Crusaders lacked siege engines and ladders, so they built them, using dismantled ships and wood from the forests of Samaria. After days of preparation, the assault began on July 13th. They attacked from 2 sides, Godfrey of Bouillon from the north, Raymond of Toulouse from the south. On July 15th, a breakthrough came. Godfrey's men wheeled a massive siege tower to the wall, scaled it, and breached the defenses. Within hours, the gates fell. What followed would stain history forever. The massacre of Jerusalem. The Crusaders entered the city and unleashed unimaginable violence. Thousands of Muslims and Jews were slaughtered, men, women, and even children. Al-Aqsa Mosque became a killing field. Blood was said to flow up to the ankles. Though likely exaggerated, the horror was real. Jewish residents who had taken refuge in their synagogue were burned alive. Those who survived begged for mercy. Few received it. This was not a battle. It was not a conquest. It was a purification by the sword. Even some crusaders, like Tancred, tried to protect civilians under their banners. But chaos reigned. The holiest city had become a graveyard. The city of peace had witnessed a war in the name of heaven, but the hand of God did not write this chapter. The hands of men did. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. After the blood had dried, the Crusaders faced the question, who would rule Jerusalem? Some wanted Raymond of Toulouse, but he declined. Eventually they chose Godfrey of Bouillon, who refused the title of king. I will not wear a crown of gold where my Saviour wore a crown of thorns. Instead, he became defender of the Holy Sepulchre. A year later, his brother Baldwin took the throne, becoming Baldwin the Fair, the first official king of Jerusalem. Thus was born the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Christian state carved from Islamic lands, defended by knights and funded by European support. They built churches over mosques, divided land among nobles, and awaited the Muslim response. For now, the cross flew above Jerusalem, but the crescent would not remain silent for long. The new order, a fragile victory. With Jerusalem taken, the Crusaders established 4 Crusader states: County of Edessa, Principality of Antioch, County of Tripoli, Kingdom of Jerusalem. Each was ruled by European lords, fortified with castles and tied to the Catholic Church. But their position was precarious, surrounded by hostile Muslim territories, dependent on new crusaders from Europe, divided by ambition, rivalry, and greed. The First Crusade had achieved the impossible. A ragtag army of peasants, knights, and zealots had taken the holiest city in Christendom. But they had done so with steel, fire, and rivers of blood. And though they sang hymns in Jerusalem's churches, the cries of the slain echoed louder in its streets. The blood had barely dried on the streets of Jerusalem when a new reality began to take shape. One forged not in peace or diplomacy, but in conquest. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was born, a foreign outpost of European power in the heart of the Islamic world. But the victory of the First Crusade was only the beginning of a conflict that would span centuries. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Crusader experiment. After the brutal sack of Jerusalem in July 1099, the surviving Crusaders crowned Godfrey of Bouillon as the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Though he refused the title of king, preferring not to wear a crown where Christ wore thorns, his brother Baldwin, I had no such hesitation. When Godfrey died a year later, Baldwin declared himself King of Jerusalem, laying the foundation of a European-style monarchy in the East. This newly formed Latin kingdom was a fragile entity, surrounded by Muslim powers, heavily reliant on European reinforcements and often disconnected from the realities of the region. But it wasn't alone. Other Crusader states emerged: County of Edessa, 1098, Principality of Antioch, 1098, County of Tripoli, 1102. Together, they formed a web of Crusader holdings known as the Outremer, meaning the land beyond the sea. These states were built on conquest, and their survival depended on continued aggression, strategic marriages, and support from Europe. Life in the Crusader kingdom, a clash of cultures. Life in the Latin kingdom was a fusion, and at times a collision, of East and West. Crusaders attempted to recreate European feudal society in a land with very different traditions, climates, and populations. Castles sprang up across the hills of Palestine and Syria, such as Crac des Chevaliers, Carac Castle, Montreal, Belvoir Fortress. These were more than just military bases. They were symbols of foreign occupation and domination. Beneath the Crusader elite, the native population, mostly Muslims, with significant Christian and Jewish communities, continued their lives under new rulers. Some Crusaders integrated, learning Arabic and adopting local customs. Others remained aloof, viewing the East with suspicion and contempt. Religious tolerance was rare. Although some local Christians were permitted to worship, Muslims were frequently taxed, displaced, or enslaved. Still, pragmatic truces and economic cooperation occasionally emerged between Crusaders and Muslim emirs, especially in border regions. Internal divisions, fractures in the Crusader ranks. Despite their common religion, the Crusader lords were far from united. The leaders of Antioch, Tripoli, Edessa, and Jerusalem often fought among themselves, each seeking more power, land, and independence. This internal disunity weakened the Crusader position. While outwardly projecting strength, the reality was often chaotic. Notable conflicts included succession disputes between nobles, power struggles between military orders like the Knights Templar, and Hospitallers' tensions between secular rulers and the Church. Meanwhile, European Crusaders who arrived in waves, sometimes decades after the First Crusade, often clashed with the established lords of the Levant. These new arrivals came with different agendas, seeking personal glory rather than the stability of the kingdom. The fragile foundations of power, the Crusaders never truly ruled by majority. In the Kingdom of Jerusalem, for example, Latin Christians were a minority among Muslims, Eastern Christians, and Jews. To maintain dominance, the Crusader elite depended heavily on fortifications. Massive castles and towers guarded every strategic pass. Italian city-states, especially Venice and Genoa, who supplied ships and manpower in exchange for trade privileges. Military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers functioned as elite warriors and landowners, annual reinforcements from Europe. Without these pillars, the Crusader states were always vulnerable to a unified Muslim response, something that had not yet materialized. But in the East, change was coming. A shifting Muslim landscape, rise of resistance. When the First Crusade began, the Muslim world was deeply divided. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was weak and ceremonial. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt was Shia and at odds with Sunni rulers. The Seljuk Turks had shattered the Byzantine army at Manzikert, but were splintered into local dynasties. These divisions made a coordinated response to the Crusaders difficult, especially in the early years. However, by the mid-12th century, new leaders were emerging, men of vision and ambition, determined to restore Muslim unity and expel the invaders. The fall of Edessa, a turning point. In 1144, the Muslim ruler Zengi of Mosul and Aleppo captured the city of Edessa, the first Crusader state to fall. This was a massive psychological blow to Christendom. Zengi was a brutal but effective commander. He used the banner of jihad, holy struggle, to rally Muslims under a common cause. Though Zengi was assassinated soon after, his legacy would pass to his son, Nur ad-Din Zengi. Nur ad-Din, the unifier of Syria. Nur ad-Din was different from his father. He was not just a warrior, but a deeply religious man who viewed the Crusaders as an insult to Islam. He implemented legal and educational reforms, construction of madrasas and mosques, strategic alliances with other Muslim leaders. Nur ad-Din's rule marked the beginning of serious, sustained resistance to the Crusader presence. And in his service was a young commander, brilliant, loyal, and unknown to the world. His name was Salahuddin. While the Crusader kingdoms indulged in opulence, infighting, and arrogance, a storm was quietly gathering in the east. A leader was rising, not born of wealth or royal lineage, but forged in fire and faith. The age of Salahuddin was near, and with it, the tide would turn. After decades of humiliation and bloodshed, the Islamic world had finally found a leader who would answer the call, a man not driven by power alone, but by faith, justice, and the dream of unity. In the heart of Syria, Nur ad-Din Zengi was rising, and with him, the first true resistance to the Crusader tide. The Zengid legacy, born from blood and chaos. The story begins with Imad ad-Din Zengi, a Turkic warlord who rose to prominence in the fractured lands of Mosul and Aleppo. Zengi ruled with an iron fist. A skilled general but feared tyrant, he saw the Crusader states as a stain upon Muslim lands. His crowning achievement came in 1144 when he shocked the world by capturing the Crusader stronghold of Edessa, the first Crusader state to fall. It sent ripples through Europe and the Muslim world, but Zengi's rise was cut short. In 1146, he was assassinated by one of his own slaves. His legacy, however, would live on through his son, Nur ad-Din Mahmud Zengi. A just ruler emerges, the rise of Nur ad-Din. Nur ad-Din, unlike his father, was not known for cruelty. He was deeply religious, modest, and just. A practicing Sunni Muslim of the Shafi'i school, he believed that the Crusader presence in the Levant was not just a military problem. It was a spiritual and civilizational insult. "If Allah grants me victory," Nur ad-Din once said, "I will not rest until I have driven the Franks from every inch of Muslim land." He wore simple clothes, avoided lavish palaces, and enforced justice in his courts, even punishing corrupt officials regardless of rank. His court became a center for scholars, jurists, and religious reformers. He encouraged the spread of madrasas, Islamic schools, funded hospitals, and patronized the building of mosques and Quranic institutions. The dream of Muslim unity. When Nur ad-Din inherited Aleppo in 1146, the Muslim world was still fragmented. The Fatimids ruled Egypt, Shia Muslims often at odds with Sunnis. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was weak and ceremonial. The Crusader states carved out their territory between them. Local rulers in Damascus, Mosul, Homs, and other cities pursued their own interests. But Nur ad-Din had a grand vision, to unify all Muslim lands under one banner, with the Abbasid Caliph as its symbolic head, and himself as the sword of Islam. His rallying cry was jihad, not simply war, but a divinely ordained mission to defend and reclaim Islamic lands, a relentless campaign against the Crusaders. With Edessa fallen, Nur ad-Din turned his attention to the remaining Crusader states. His campaigns were calculated, disciplined, and driven by both religious conviction and military logic. He scored victories across Syria and the Levant, 1150. He defeated the Crusaders near Inab, killing the powerful Count of Tripoli and displaying his severed head in Aleppo. 1154, he captured Damascus, finally uniting northern and southern Syria under his rule, a critical step toward Muslim unity. He defended against repeated Crusader offensives and neutralized their attempts to divide the Muslim front. This made Nur ad-Din not only feared by the Franks, but respected by the Muslim populace, a rare combination. Building institutions, Islam as a foundation of rule. Nur ad-Din knew that wars were not won by swords alone. To build a lasting Islamic revival, he focused on institutional reform, built over 40 madrasas, especially to promote Sunni Orthodoxy commissioned hospitals, bimaristans, and public welfare buildings, elevated the role of the Qadi, Islamic judge, to ensure justice and law. Sponsored Islamic scholars like Ibn Asakir and al-Ghazali's followers. His reign saw a renaissance of Islamic learning and spiritual renewal, in stark contrast to the decadence of Crusader courts. The growing shadow of Egypt. While Nur ad-Din secured Syria, his eyes turned toward Egypt, a rich and strategic land ruled by the weakening Fatimid Caliphate. Egypt was a tempting target for both Crusaders and Muslim powers alike. The Fatimids, being Shia, were ideologically opposed to Nur ad-Din's Sunni vision. Internal power struggles had made Egypt vulnerable. The Kingdom of Jerusalem saw a golden opportunity to expand into Egyptian territory, but Nur ad-Din moved first. He sent his trusted general, Shirkuh, to intervene, and with him a young Kurdish officer whose name would soon echo through history, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the world as Salahuddin. As Nur ad-Din carved a legacy of faith, reform and resistance, a new figure was learning at his side. Salahuddin, molded in the fire of jihad and politics, would rise from Nur ad-Din's shadow and become the lion of Islam. The seeds of Salahuddin's rise. In 1164, Shirkuh and Salahuddin marched into Egypt for the first time, drawn into a chaotic civil war between rival viziers. It would not be the last. After years of back and forth, alliances and betrayals, Nur ad-Din's forces would finally gain the upper hand in 1169, when Salahuddin was appointed vizier of Egypt, technically under the Fatimids, but loyal to Nur ad-Din. This was a game-changer. For the first time since the Crusades began, the two greatest regions of the Muslim world, Syria and Egypt, were being drawn under one strategic command. The tension between mentor and student. Though Nur ad-Din had placed Salahuddin in Egypt, tensions slowly grew between the aging ruler and his rising general. Some feared that Salahuddin, gaining popularity and consolidating power, might become too independent. Others saw the union of Egypt and Syria under a single ruler as inevitable, but Nur ad-Din, ever the idealist, continued his mission. In 1171, Salahuddin officially abolished the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and reinstated Sunni rule, fulfilling Nur ad-Din's long-held dream. Still, the consolidation of power by Salahuddin stirred unease in Damascus. Would the dream of unity now give way to a new rivalry? The answer would come soon. The sudden death of a visionary. In 1174, while planning a new campaign into Palestine, perhaps even to retake Jerusalem, Nur ad-Din died suddenly at the age of 56. His death sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. He left behind a fragmented inheritance, with no strong heir to replace him. His son was only 11 years old. His generals squabbled for control. And in Egypt, Salahuddin stood poised, not as a usurper, but as the only man capable of fulfilling Nur ad-Din's vision. Nur ad-Din Zangi was a man of principle in an age of warlords, a leader who fought not for his own glory, but for the revival of a civilization. Though he did not live to see Jerusalem freed, his torch would pass to another who would carry it all the way to Al-Quds. From the rugged mountains of Mesopotamia to the golden sands of Cairo, from humble beginnings to the heights of command, a man was being shaped by destiny, a man whose name would strike fear in his enemies and pride in the hearts of believers. This is the story of Salahuddin Ayyubi, Radiyallahu Anhu, the Lion of Islam. A Kurdish birth, roots in the mountains. Salahuddin Ayyubi, Radiyallahu Anhu, whose full name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was born in 1137 CE in the city of Tikrit, located in present-day Iraq. He belonged to a Kurdish family from the Rawadiya tribe, a noble but modest background, far removed from the seats of power. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was a respected officer serving under Imad ad-Din Zangi, the fierce ruler of Mosul and Aleppo. When Salahuddin was born, his family was already in a state of transition, forced to leave Tikrit shortly after his birth due to political fallout. They relocated to Mosul, and later to Baalbek and Damascus, where Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, spent his formative years. Though raised among warriors, Salahuddin's early life was not marked by dreams of conquest. He was quiet, introspective, and more interested in religion and scholarship than the sword. Yet fate had other plans: education and character, a mind shaped by faith. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, received a traditional Islamic education. He studied fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, Quran and Hadith, Arabic grammar and poetry, and the stories of past prophets and righteous leaders. He grew up with deep respect for Islamic ethics, particularly justice, mercy, and humility. Unlike many military figures of his time, he avoided luxury and excess. Even at the height of his power, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, slept on simple mats, gave generously in charity, and wept during prayers. His character was a blend of warrior's courage and a saint's heart. He was a man of few words and great deeds, wrote one chronicler, gentle with his people, but a lion on the battlefield. Entering the arena, service under Nur ad-Din Zangi. In the 1150s, Salahuddin's Radiyallahu Anhu uncle, the powerful general Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, entered the service of Nur ad-Din Zangi, ruler of Aleppo and a champion of jihad against the Crusaders. Under Shirkuh's mentorship, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, began his military training. Though not a natural soldier at first, he quickly adapted, learning the art of siege warfare, tactics, and statesmanship. Nur ad-Din recognized something unique in him: a calm intelligence, unshakable discipline, and a deep devotion to Islam. By his late 20s, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, was already serving in military campaigns across Syria. But his true testing ground would be Egypt, a land on the edge of collapse. The crisis in Egypt, a struggle for control. In the 1160s, Egypt was ruled by the weakened Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty in terminal decline. Torn by civil war, plagued by famine, and surrounded by enemies, it became the center of a three-way struggle. The Crusaders, led by the Kingdom of Jerusalem, sought to seize Egypt for its wealth. The Fatimids tried to survive through alliances and deception, and Nur ad-Din, wanting to prevent Crusader dominance, sent Shirkuh and Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, to intervene. In 1164 CE, the first campaign began. Over several expeditions between 1164 and 1169, Shirkuh and Salahuddin fought both Fatimid forces and Crusader armies. These were battles of swords and sieges, but also of intrigue and diplomacy. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, though still a junior officer, began gaining respect. His humility, courage, and calmness under pressure made him stand out. In 1169, Shirkuh died suddenly in Cairo. The Fatimid Caliph, impressed by Salahuddin's conduct, appointed him vizier, a move that shocked even Nur ad-Din. At just 31 years old, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, became the most powerful man in Egypt. End of the Fatimids, rise of Sunni Islam. The vizier in a Shia state, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, remained loyal to Sunni Islam and to Nur ad-Din Zangi. He moved cautiously but decisively. Between 1169 and 1171, he reformed the Egyptian army, strengthened Cairo's defenses, purged corrupt officials, and won over the public with fairness and justice. Finally, in 1171, with the Fatimid Caliph gravely ill, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, ended the Fatimid dynasty. He declared allegiance to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, restoring Sunni rule in Egypt after 2 centuries. It was one of the most important moments in Islamic history, and a fulfillment of Nur ad-Din's dream. In a single stroke, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, had changed the map of Islam. Egypt, the jewel of the Nile, was now united with Syria under the banner of jihad. Tensions and loyalty, the shadow of Nur ad-Din. Despite his growing fame, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, remained loyal to Nur ad-Din, yet their relationship became strained. Nur ad-Din feared Salahuddin was becoming too powerful, too independent. He considered removing him from Egypt, but Salahuddin, ever respectful, refused to act against his former master. He continued to rule Egypt justly, preparing it for the great battles to come. In 1174, before a confrontation could occur, Nur ad-Din died suddenly. With his death, the dream of unity risked collapsing into infighting. Nur ad-Din's son was a minor, and his territories were in chaos. The question on every mind was, would Salahuddin claim power for himself? The man behind the legend, Virtues of Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, was no ordinary conqueror. His rise was not a tale of betrayal or ambition. It was destiny shaped by humility and vision. His key virtues were taqwa, God consciousness. He never missed his prayers, even on campaign. He fasted regularly and often wept during Quran recitation. Adl, justice. He never tolerated injustice, whether committed by emirs or soldiers. He treated even his enemies fairly. Zuhd, asceticism. Though ruler of vast lands, he lived simply. He wore modest clothes and often gave his wealth to the poor. Shaja, courage. On the battlefield, he led from the front. His presence inspired courage among troops. Hilm, forbearance. Even when insulted or betrayed, he rarely reacted in anger. He forgave many of his enemies. No one hated war more than Salahuddin, wrote a European chronicler, and yet no one fought it more bravely when justice demanded it. The stage is set toward Jerusalem. By 1174, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, had full control over Egypt. Over the next decade, he would expand into Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, and eventually unite nearly the entire Muslim Near East. His mission was now clear, to reclaim Al-Quds, Jerusalem, not for personal glory, but for Allah and for the oppressed Muslims under Crusader tyranny. He did not seek fame, but became immortal. He did not seek war, but delivered justice through it. In Salahuddin Ayyubi, Radiyallahu Anhu, the Islamic world found not just a warrior, but a moral compass. And now the journey to Jerusalem was about to begin. With the Fatimids gone, and Egypt under firm Sunni rule, a new dawn had broken. Yet for Salahuddin Ayyubi, Radiyallahu Anhu, this was only the beginning. Before the Lion of Islam could march on Jerusalem, he had to achieve something far more difficult, uniting a divided Muslim world. End of the Fatimid Caliphate, a shattered legacy. The year 1171 CE marked a turning point in Islamic history. The centuries-old Fatimid Caliphate, weakened by internal conflict, finally collapsed. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, abolished the Shi, a regime in Egypt, and restored Sunni allegiance to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. For the first time in 200 years, Egypt stood united with the Sunni world. But the path ahead was treacherous. Egypt was wealthy, but isolated. The Crusaders still threatened from the west, and Syria remained fractured. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, knew Islam's survival would depend on unity, consolidation of power, balancing sword and state. Between 1171 and 1174, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, focused on Egypt. He built fortifications in Cairo, including what would later become the famous Citadel of Cairo, reorganized the military with disciplined, well-paid troops, encouraged scholars, judges, and Sunni institutions, strengthened the navy to guard the Red Sea from Crusader attacks. But the most delicate challenge was not military. It was political. Syria, once under Nur ad-Din Zangi, had fragmented after his death in 1174. His young son lacked the strength to rule, and rival emirs fought for dominance. The question facing Salahuddin was bold and dangerous. Should he remain the ruler of Egypt or become the savior of the Ummah? He chose the harder path. March into Syria, claiming the legacy of Nur ad-Din. In 1174, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, marched into Syria under the banner of unity and jihad. His arrival in Damascus was welcomed by its people, who viewed him as a stabilizing force. But not everyone agreed. Former Zengid emirs saw him as an outsider, a Kurdish general from Egypt with too much ambition. Over the next 5 years, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, engaged in both warfare and diplomacy. Aleppo, a vital city in the north, resisted him under the Zengid prince. Mosul, seat of Nur ad-Din's heirs, refused to acknowledge him. In Hama, Homs and Baalbek, rival warlords either submitted or were subdued. He used a combination of sieges, bribery, political marriages, and when needed, swift, decisive battles. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, was not just a general, he was a master statesman. He fought more battles with ink than with iron, noted a chronicler. By 1183, he controlled Egypt, Damascus, Hama, Homs, and Aleppo, effectively ruling over a new Islamic empire stretching from North Africa to northern Syria. Diplomatic genius, the art of strategic patience. While war brought many cities under his banner, diplomacy was often his greatest weapon. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, refused to be drawn into long, fruitless wars. When dealing with stubborn rivals, he offered autonomy under his suzerainty, generous pensions and titles, peaceful transitions instead of bloodshed. He also kept his eyes on the larger picture. He negotiated temporary truces with the Kingdom of Jerusalem when needed, avoided conflict with the Byzantines, and maintained friendly relations with the Abbasid Caliph, who endorsed his campaigns. This strategic patience earned him both territory and time. He knew when to strike, a historian later wrote, but more importantly, he knew when not to. Military reforms, building the sword of jihad. Behind the diplomacy, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, was preparing for a greater goal, jihad to liberate Jerusalem. His military reforms between 1174 and 1186 were revolutionary. Professional standing army gone were the unreliable tribal levies. He created a full-time salaried force with strict discipline. Furusiya training. His cavalry underwent elite training in swordsmanship, archery and tactics. Horsemen became the backbone of his army. Fortification strategy. Salahuddin reinforced key cities with walls, citadels and watchtowers, especially along Crusader borders. Naval development. With the threat from European navies growing, he expanded ports in Alexandria and built a defensive fleet. Logistical organization. His armies had access to supply lines, medics, engineers and scouts, giving them greater endurance than their foes. Above all, he ensured the army was motivated not by loot, but by faith. "We are soldiers of Allah," he told his men. "Our reward lies in Jannah, not in gold." Revival of faith, spiritual foundation of the campaigns. Unlike most rulers of his time, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, did not rule through fear. He ruled through taqwa. He revived Sunni religious institutions across Egypt and Syria, built madrasas and mosques, encouraged the spread of hadith and Quran studies, appointed honest qadis, judges, and imams, fought corruption even among his own men. His personal devotion inspired the masses. Often, people from conquered cities embraced him not out of fear, but love. Even in victory, he refused extravagance. When he captured cities, he protected churches, monasteries, and civilians, setting a standard rarely seen in medieval warfare. The sword of Salahuddin was sharp, a Christian bishop wrote, but his soul was kind. The call for jihad, preparing for the holy war. By 1186, after 15 years of relentless work, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, had achieved what few thought possible. He had unified Egypt and Syria, neutralized internal threats, prepared a disciplined army, and ignited a spiritual revival across the Muslim world. Now it was time to answer the greatest call of all, to liberate Al-Quds, the third holiest site in Islam, from Crusader occupation. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, issued the formal call for jihad. Jerusalem cries out, Al-Aqsa awaits her liberator. O Muslims, the time of testing is over, now begins the time of honor. The cry echoed across cities and villages. Volunteers flocked from Arabia, Iraq, and even as far as Andalusia. It was not merely a war of land, it was a war of the soul. A just war for the protection of the oppressed, the honor of Islam, and the sanctity of Jerusalem. The Crusader kingdom, a fragile giant, while Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, built unity. The kingdom of Jerusalem was weakening. Its leaders were divided. Baldwin IV, the leper king, was dying. Power-hungry barons like Raynald of Chatillon violated truces and pillaged Muslim caravans. A nobleman like Guy of Lusignan lacked the respect of the nobles. Corruption, arrogance, and overconfidence plagued the Crusaders. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, waited, watching, planning. Then in 1187, Raynald made the fatal mistake of attacking a Muslim caravan, including women and pilgrims, despite a peace treaty. It was the spark Salahuddin needed. The trap was closing, the armies were ready, and now the lion would roar. While Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, forged a unified Muslim world with vision, strategy, and faith, his enemies in the Kingdom of Jerusalem were doing the opposite. Greed replaced purpose, honor was lost to ambition, and soon the mighty Crusader state would begin to crumble, not from war, but from within. The death of Baldwin IV. End of a tragic reign. In 1185, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem lost its last capable leader. King Baldwin IV, known as the Leper King, had ruled with remarkable resilience despite his debilitating illness. Intelligent, politically shrewd, and militarily bold, Baldwin IV had kept the Crusader state afloat through diplomacy and discipline, but his disease progressed rapidly. His hands were deformed, his sight faded. His body deteriorated, yet until his last breath, Baldwin resisted corruption and held his kingdom together. Before dying, he named his young nephew Baldwin V as heir, under a regency meant to prevent anyone noble from seizing power. But his death removed the last check on the greed of Crusader warlords. With the Leper King gone, wrote a chronicler, the lions turned on each other. Power vacuum, Guy of Lusignan and Raynald of Chatillon. The regency collapsed within months. By 1186, the child king Baldwin V had died mysteriously, some say poisoned. The throne passed to Guy of Lusignan, a French nobleman who had married Baldwin's sister, Sibylla. But Guy was not a born leader. He lacked experience in war. He was disliked by the older, powerful nobles. And worst of all, he allowed himself to be manipulated by Reynald of Chatillon. Reynald was no ordinary knight. He had once been imprisoned by Muslims for 17 years and emerged from captivity a cruel, vengeful fanatic. He broke truces with Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, raided caravans, and even threatened to march on Makkah and Medina. "He is not a knight," a contemporary said. "He is a mad dog in armor." His actions were not just reckless, they were catastrophic. By provoking Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, repeatedly, Reynald was dragging the Crusader kingdom toward total war at the worst possible time. Balian of Ibelin, the last voice of reason. Amid the chaos, one nobleman stood apart, Balian of Ibelin. Born of Frankish and Eastern blood, Balian was a respected lord and military commander. He had served Baldwin IV loyally and believed in coexistence with the local Muslim population. He opposed Guy's coronation and Reynald's provocations, urging diplomacy and restraint, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of power struggles and pride. "The throne is not a prize," he reportedly said. "It is a responsibility." As the Crusader court in Jerusalem became a den of scheming nobles and war-hungry fanatics, Balian retreated to his lands, watching with sorrow as everything he had tried to protect began to collapse. Corruption in the Holy Land, a kingdom without a cause. The Crusader states, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa, had once been forged with religious zeal. But by the 1180s, that zeal had turned to greed. Instead of defending Christendom, many barons enslaved local Christians and Muslims alike, taxed pilgrims and merchants, built lavish estates on stolen lands, and ignored the pleas of the Church and the papacy. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, once pious military orders, were now political players, divided among themselves. The Pope's envoys called for unity and humility, but their cries went unheard. "Their swords were stained with gold, not blood," wrote a European monk. The rise of fanatics, the fatal error. Reynald of Chatillon's final crime came in 1187. He ambushed a peaceful Muslim caravan returning from pilgrimage, full of merchants, women and children. He looted the goods, took prisoners, and refused to return them, even after Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, personally demanded it. This was not just a violation of a truce. It was an insult to Islam itself. The caravan included family members of Salahuddin's household, and Reynald arrogantly declared, "Tell your Muhammad to save you." It was a declaration of war. Even some Crusader nobles were horrified. But Guy of Lusignan, weak and unsure, refused to punish Reynald. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, now had religious and political justification to launch full jihad. Narrator. Slow, dramatic music begins. The Crusader kingdom had dug its own grave. The lion had been provoked. The swords of the Muslims had been sharpened, and now the reckoning would come. The Muslim response. A call heard across the east. When Salahuddin Radiyallahu Anhu declared war, the Muslim world answered. From Damascus to Mosul, from Egypt to Yemen, fighters, scholars, and even farmers prepared for jihad. The army that had taken 15 years to build was now unleashed. Banners were raised, horses were saddled, prayers echoed in mosques. "This is not conquest," Salahuddin said. "This is justice." He swore by the Quran to avenge the caravan, punish Reynald, and liberate Jerusalem, not for empire, but for Al-Aqsa. In contrast, the Crusader army was cobbled together in panic, poorly supplied, led by divided commanders, and unsure of their strategy. They did not march as a unified force, they marched as a desperate one. Crusader collapse, the inevitable fall, begins. The Crusader kingdom was outmatched in almost every way. Numerically, Salahuddin's army dwarfed them. Strategically, the Muslims had better scouts, mobility, and terrain knowledge. Spiritually, the Muslims were unified and focused, the Crusaders divided and arrogant, but worst of all, the Crusaders underestimated their enemy. They called Salahuddin weak, a chronicler later wrote, but they mistook mercy for cowardice. Guy of Lusignan made one final fatal error. Against advice from his own nobles, he marched his army across dry plains in midsummer, toward a place called Hattin. He thought he could ambush Salahuddin. Instead, he walked into a trap. In the long war for Jerusalem, there was one battle that shattered the Crusaders' dreams and shifted the balance of power forever. It was fought under the scorching sun, between a desperate army and a righteous force united by faith. The field was called Hattin, and it would become a graveyard for the cross. Reynald's final crime, the Caravan Massacre. In the spring of 1187, the fragile truce between the Crusader kingdom and Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, was shattered by one man. Reynald of Chatillon, the fanatical warlord of Kerak, launched a brutal raid on a large Muslim caravan returning from Makkah. The caravan carried merchants and goods, women and children, and pilgrims under the protection of peace treaties. Reynald ambushed them, looted their property, and imprisoned the travelers. He refused to release them, even when Salahuddin himself offered ransom. Reynald's blasphemous words echoed through the Muslim world. "Tell your Muhammad to save you." This was not just a violation of diplomacy, it was a declaration of war, a challenge not just to Salahuddin, but to Islam itself. Salahuddin's response, a righteous war declared. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, responded with measured fury. He sent messengers to cities across the Muslim world, invoking the duty of jihad. He made his niyyah, intention, clear: to punish the violators of treaties, to liberate Al-Aqsa, and to unite Muslims under one banner. From Egypt to Syria, from Arabia to Mesopotamia, warriors, scholars, and common men rallied to his call. "The blood of the innocent cries out," Salahuddin declared. "We ride not for revenge, but for justice." An army unlike any before it was now forming, disciplined, united, and driven by purpose. The Crusaders mobilize, desperation, and division. In Jerusalem, panic gripped the Crusader court. Guy of Lusignan, now king, had no real authority or respect. Reynald, the architect of war, was urging confrontation. Balian of Ibelin warned of disaster if they left the city unguarded. But the Crusader leadership, desperate to maintain dominance, made a reckless choice. They would march out to meet Salahuddin in open battle. On July 2nd, 1187, the Crusaders mustered around 20,000 men, including heavy knights from Jerusalem and Tripoli, Templars and Hospitallers, and foot soldiers armed for siege or defense, not desert warfare. They set out toward Tiberias, hoping to relieve the fortress besieged by Salahuddin. But they walked into a well-laid trap. The trap of Hattin. Salahuddin's strategy unfolds. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, had planned this for months. He chose the battleground near Horns of Hattin, two extinct volcanic hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee. The land was dry, sun-scorched, and far from water sources. Using scorched earth tactics, Salahuddin burned fields along the Crusaders' route, poisoned or blocked wells, and surrounded their army from a distance. For 2 days, the Crusaders marched under the blazing July sun, running out of water, food, and strength. Soldiers collapsed from heat. Horses died of thirst. By the time they reached Hattin, they were exhausted, demoralized, and cornered. The night before battle, smoke, fire, and despair. On the night of July 3rd, the Muslims lit fires and incense all around the Crusader camp. The smoke choked their enemies and blocked out the stars. Salahuddin's forces beat war drums, chanted verses of the Quran, and kept the Crusaders awake through psychological warfare. "Their spirits broke before the swords ever struck," wrote one chronicler. The Crusaders could not sleep. They could not see, and they could no longer think clearly. By dawn, they were trapped and desperate. The Battle of Hattin, July 4th, 1187. Morning broke, and with it, one of the most decisive battles in medieval history began. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, divided his army strategically. Archers and light cavalry harassed the Crusaders' flanks. Infantry blocked their movement to water. Heavy cavalry waited for the right moment to strike. The Crusaders tried to charge, but they were too tired, their horses too weak, their cohesion shattered. By midday, Muslim forces encircled them completely. It was as if fire from the sky rained down upon them, wrote Ibn al-Athir. Knights collapsed from dehydration. Infantry fled. Templars and Hospitallers made a desperate stand, but were overwhelmed. The final collapse, death and capture. By afternoon, the Crusader army had disintegrated. Reynald of Chatillon was captured and brought before Salahuddin. Guy of Lusignan, too, was taken alive, bewildered and defeated. The true cross, carried by the Crusader army as a holy relic, was seized by the Muslims, a devastating blow to Christian morale. Salahuddin offered water to Guy of Lusignan as a gesture of mercy, but he refused to do the same for Reynald. When Reynald arrogantly refused to repent, Salahuddin executed him personally, fulfilling his vow to avenge the caravan massacre. "It is not my custom to kill prisoners," he said, "but this man has passed all limits." The rest of the captured knights were either ransomed or executed, especially Templars, whom Salahuddin saw as religious fanatics beyond redemption. Victory for Islam, a day of gratitude, not triumph. Salahuddin did not celebrate wildly. Instead, he prayed, gave thanks to Allah, and honored the fallen on both sides. He forbade looting, distributed water to the wounded, and ensured that the battlefield was cleared with dignity. "This victory is Allah's," he told his men. "We are only his servants." The Battle of Hattin was not just a military win, it was a moral and spiritual victory. It marked the beginning of the end of Crusader dominance in the Holy Land. Aftermath, the fall of Crusader power. In the weeks following Hattin, Salahuddin's army swept across Palestine. Town after town surrendered or was liberated, and the fortresses of the Crusaders fell like dominoes. By September 1187, just 2 months after Hattin, Salahuddin would reach the gates of Jerusalem itself. The Crusader kingdom, built over 88 years, was undone in a single summer. Its soldiers dead, its leaders captured, its holy relics lost. "At Hattin," wrote a Latin bishop, "God turned his face away from us, and the cross was buried in dust." But the story was not yet over, for though Jerusalem would soon return to Muslim hands, the West would respond with rage and with ships full of new crusaders. But the world had changed. The myth of Crusader invincibility had been broken, and in the East, one name had risen above all others, not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of justice: Salahuddin. The cross had fallen at Hattin. The Crusader kingdoms lay in ruin, but one city still remained, sacred to 3 faiths, blood-stained by past conquest: Jerusalem. Jerusalem in crisis, aftermath of Hattin. After the crushing battle of Hattin, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, moved swiftly. Acre surrendered. Ascalon, Nablus and Jaffa fell. The Crusader garrisons either fled, were captured or opened their gates, but the crown jewel was still in enemy hands: Al-Quds, Jerusalem. The Crusader hold on the city was fragile. There were no major armies left to defend it. Most knights were either dead or captured. Inside Jerusalem, refugees poured in from surrounding towns. Fear and panic spread among the population, and the city's spiritual and political future hung in the balance. The man left in charge of defending it was not a king. Balian of Ibelin, the reluctant defender. Balian of Ibelin, once a nobleman of moderate influence, had become a central figure in Jerusalem's survival. After escaping from the chaos of Hattin, Balian sought permission from Salahuddin to rescue his wife and children in Jerusalem. Salahuddin, true to his word, granted safe passage on the condition that Balian would not take up arms. But when Balian reached the city, everything changed. The people begged him to stay. The city was leaderless. Panic was everywhere. Even the Latin patriarch implored him, "If you leave, we are lost." Balian wrote to Salahuddin, apologizing and asking forgiveness for breaking his oath. The Sultan, in a rare act of respect, forgave him. "I would rather see a man of honor break his word to save innocents," Salahuddin reportedly said. Balian stayed, and he prepared the city, not for victory, but for a dignified surrender. The siege begins, September 20th, 1187. Salahuddin's army of 20,000, 30,000 men surrounded Jerusalem. He did not begin with fire or blood. Instead, he sent a message: submit peacefully, surrender the city, and no harm will come to you. The defenders refused. Balian, though wise, could not surrender without negotiating terms. The clergy, still clinging to past Crusader pride, believed the city could hold, and so the siege began. Salahuddin's forces set up siege engines, launched catapults day and night, and blocked all exits and supply routes. Jerusalem shook under the bombardment. Inside the walls, the people prayed in churches, wept in fear, and prepared for either death or slavery. But unlike 1099, this siege would end very differently. Balian's desperate bluff, the threat of destruction. Balian knew the city could not withstand a full assault, so he played a dangerous card. He told Salahuddin, "If you storm the walls, we will burn every building. We will destroy the Masjid al-Aqsa. We will kill our own women and children and die fighting." The Sultan listened. He could have attacked, but he chose mercy over pride. Instead of responding with threats, Salahuddin opened negotiations. The two men, warrior and noble, Muslim and Christian, sat under a white flag and discussed peace. It was a meeting between two civilized minds in a world torn by war. The surrender of Jerusalem, October 2nd, 1187. The agreement was simple and revolutionary. No massacre, no looting. Civilians would be allowed to ransom themselves. The poor who could not pay would be freed anyway. Balian formally surrendered the city on October 2nd, 1187. The 27th of Rajab, the date believed to mark the Isra, and Mi'raj, the night journey of Prophet Muhammad, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, to Jerusalem. For Muslims, the symbolism was powerful, and the reality was even more profound. Salahuddin's mercy, a new kind of victory. As Muslim soldiers entered Jerusalem, there was no looting, no killing, no desecration of churches. The Christian inhabitants were given 40 days to arrange ransom or leave peacefully. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, personally paid the ransom for hundreds of poor families who could not afford freedom. He allowed the Christian clergy to retain their sacred objects. He reopened Masjid al-Aqsa for Muslim prayer for the first time in 88 years. When the Crusader patriarch attempted to flee with gold and treasures, Salahuddin stopped him and redistributed the wealth to the poor. Even the Eastern Christians, long oppressed under Crusader rule, welcomed Salahuddin as a liberator. A contrast with 1099, a tale of two sieges. The First Crusade in 1099 ended with massacre and bloodshed. Crusader chroniclers boasted of killing 70,000 people, including men, women, children, even those seeking refuge in mosques and churches. One knight wrote, "The streets ran with blood. We rode in it up to our knees." But in 1187, Salahuddin chose a different path. He treated his enemies with dignity. He upheld Islamic ethics of war, and he offered an example of compassion in victory. The restoration of Al-Quds, Jerusalem reclaimed. After nearly a century, Jerusalem was back under Muslim rule. The crescent replaced the cross, not with arrogance, but with reverence. Salahuddin personally led the first Friday prayer in Masjid al-Aqsa. The khutbah sermon praised Allah for the liberation of the holy city and called for justice, unity, and humility. He invited Jews back to the city, whom the Crusaders had expelled or killed. Under his rule, Christians, Jews, and Muslims would live once more, not in perfect harmony, but under a principled protection. "This city belongs to God," Salahuddin once said, "not to me." A moment that echoed across the world. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 shook Europe to its core. Kings wept in churches. Popes called for a new crusade. The myth of Christian invincibility was shattered. But in the East, a new legend was born. Salahuddin Ayyubi, Radiyallahu Anhu, once a quiet scholar, now stood as the symbol of Islamic justice, of mercy in war, and of honor above hatred. He had not just won a city, he had won hearts, even among his enemies. In the sands of time, few victories shine as bright as this, not for the blood spilled, but for the blood spared. For in the heart of war, Salahuddin showed the world a higher path, one of honor, compassion, and faith. In 1187, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, reclaimed Jerusalem, a city soaked in centuries of blood and sanctity. But in the courts of Europe, the news struck like thunder. The Holy Sepulchre was lost. Christendom cried for vengeance. A new crusade was born. The shock of Jerusalem's fall, Europe in mourning. When word of Jerusalem's surrender reached Europe, it was met with outrage in churches, anguish among kings, and an explosion of crusading fervor. Pope Gregory VIII issued a papal bull, Audita Tremendi, calling for all of Christendom to unite and launch a third crusade. This would be no ragtag army like the first. This time, three great monarchs would lead: Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard the Fine of England, the man who would earn the name Lionheart. The rise of Richard the Lionheart, crusade with a crown. Richard of England was everything a crusader king was supposed to be: fearless in battle, devoutly religious, and ambitious beyond measure. He saw the crusade not just as a spiritual duty, but as an opportunity to cement his legacy as a warrior king. But the journey was fraught with difficulty. Frederick Barbarossa drowned before even reaching the Holy Land. Philip II fell ill and later returned to France. Only Richard would remain to face Salahuddin. Siege of Acre, a bloody beginning, 1189 to 1191. Before reaching Jerusalem, Richard had to first break Salahuddin's hold on the coast. The port city of Acre became the first battlefield of this new crusade. The siege lasted 2 brutal years. Salahuddin tried repeatedly to relieve the city, but crusader reinforcements poured in. Richard's arrival in 1191 tipped the balance. With masterful tactics and overwhelming force, the Crusaders took Acre, but what followed was dark and dishonorable. Richard, frustrated by delayed ransom payments and fearing betrayal, ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners, including women and children. Even some of his fellow Crusaders were horrified. Salahuddin was deeply grieved, but did not retaliate in kind. He vowed to fight Richard honorably, despite the savagery he had witnessed. The duel of generals, Richard versus Salahuddin. What followed was one of the most fascinating military rivalries in medieval history. Two men, each the champion of his faith, played a game of war across the Holy Land. Their clash was not just on the battlefield, but in strategy, intelligence, and reputation. Richard the Lionheart, bold, aggressive, and brilliant in open battle, a master of fortification and naval supply lines. Salahuddin Ayyubi, Radiyallahu Anhu, patient, defensive, and deeply principled, skilled at ambushes, cutting supply chains, and unifying his forces through jihad. They fought without hatred, even exchanging gifts and letters during pauses in battle. Richard once fell ill during the campaign. Salahuddin sent his personal physician and cooling snow from the mountains to ease his fever. In another incident, Richard's horse was killed in battle. Salahuddin sent him 2 new ones. This was war at its most chivalrous and complex, Battle of Arsuf, September 7th, 1191. The most significant open clash came near the coastal town of Arsuf. Richard led a massive column along the shore, aiming to retake Jaffa. Salahuddin's forces harassed them daily, avoiding full engagement. But at Arsuf, Salahuddin launched a decisive attack. The Muslim cavalry charged again and again, but Richard held firm. Then, at the perfect moment, he launched a countercharge with his heavy knights. The Muslim army was pushed back, but not destroyed. Though Richard claimed victory, Salahuddin preserved most of his forces and retreated in good order. It was a tactical win for Richard, but strategically inconclusive. Jerusalem remained untouched. The question of Jerusalem: advance or retreat? After Arsuf, Richard retook Jaffa and strengthened Crusader positions on the coast. But the heart of the matter still loomed. Should they march on Jerusalem? Richard's advisors debated endlessly. The Crusaders lacked cavalry and had no secure supply line. If they took the city, Salahuddin could easily besiege it once they left. The weather, disease, and morale posed constant threats. Richard advanced toward Jerusalem twice, coming within sight of its walls, but never attacked. To the Crusaders, it was devastating. To Salahuddin, it was a testament to his strategic resilience. Truce and diplomacy, a peace of honor, 1192. By 1192, both sides were exhausted. Salahuddin had defended his realm admirably, but his resources were stretched thin. Richard had gained prestige, but could not reclaim Jerusalem. The 2 great men chose to end the war with words, not swords. They signed the Treaty of Jaffa. Crusaders would keep the coastal cities from Jaffa to Tyre. Muslims would retain control of Jerusalem. Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit the holy sites freely and safely. It was a compromise, but one that saved thousands of lives. Richard and Salahuddin never met in person, but their respect was mutual. When Richard left the Holy Land, he sent a message: "If I had to lose Jerusalem, I am glad it was to a man like you." The end of an era, 2 legends. Depart. Shortly after the treaty, Richard returned to Europe, only to be captured and ransomed by enemies. He died in 1199 from a wound in battle. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, physically worn from years of jihad and governance, passed away in 1193. He died without wealth, having given almost everything in charity. At his funeral, it is said that only 1 gold coin was found in his possession. A banner was raised at his grave. Here lies the servant of Allah, who could conquer kingdoms, but could not carry gold to the grave. Legacy of the Third Crusade, echoes that never faded. The Third Crusade had ended. Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule. The Crusader states survived along the coast, but barely. The idea of reclaiming the Holy Land would continue, but never again with such powerful kings. But more enduring than victories or losses were the legends. Richard the Lionheart became a romantic icon in the West, the Crusader king par excellence. Salahuddin Ayyubi, Radiyallahu Anhu, became a hero across East and West, honored in Islamic tradition for his piety, courage, and justice, admired in Europe for his mercy and honor. Even centuries later, Christian poets and historians would praise Salahuddin more than their own kings. In a time of cruelty, he stood apart. In a war of swords, he fought with dignity. History remembers not just who wins, but how they win. And when the dust settled in the Holy Land, 2 names echoed across empires: Richard and Salahuddin. In Ridley Scott's 2005 epic Kingdom of Heaven, a humble blacksmith becomes a baron, a hero, and the savior of Jerusalem. But behind the cinematic legend lies a far more complex, fascinating, and real man, Balian of Ibelin. Separating fact from fiction, Hollywood has a habit of rewriting history, sometimes for drama, sometimes for simplicity. In Kingdom of Heaven, Balian is portrayed as the illegitimate son of a nobleman, a blacksmith in France, a man who journeys to the Holy Land to seek redemption, a lover of Queen Sibylla, and finally, the commander of Jerusalem during its final stand. But how much of this is true? Let's separate the myth from the man. Who was the historical Balian of Ibelin? The real Balian of Ibelin was no blacksmith. He was born into the house of Ibelin, a respected noble family in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. Born around 1143, Balian was the youngest son of Balian of Ibelin, a knight who rose to prominence and was granted the lordship of Ibelin, a small but strategic territory in the kingdom. Balian's older brothers were also nobles, and Balian himself became lord of Ramla and Nablus through marriage to Maria Comnena, the widow of King Amalric the Fey, and a stepmother to Queen Sibylla. So, unlike in the film, Balian wasn't an outsider. He was deeply entrenched in the political and noble fabric of the kingdom. A nobleman, not a blacksmith. In Kingdom of Heaven, Balian is introduced as a grieving, guilt-ridden blacksmith, illegitimate and unknowing of his noble lineage. He's offered a chance at redemption by his father, played by Liam Neeson, and travels to the Holy Land after killing a priest. This is pure fiction. Balian was born noble. He never worked a forge. He didn't kill a priest. And he wasn't discovered late in life by a wandering noble father. This transformation from blacksmith to nobleman was likely Hollywood's way of making him more relatable to modern audiences, the classic every man becomes a hero narrative. Balian and Queen Sibylla, a fictional affair. In the film, Balian has a romantic relationship with Queen Sibylla, sister of Baldwin IV and mother of the boy king Baldwin V. Their affair becomes central to the story's emotional stakes. But in reality, there is no evidence of any such relationship. Historically, Sibylla was married to Guy of Lusignan. Balian was her stepfather's son-in-law and likely had a formal, if distant, relationship with her. The romance is purely fictional, inserted to add drama, betrayal, and heartbreak. It also helped give the film a love story arc, but at the cost of historical accuracy. The defense of Jerusalem, a truth greater than fiction. Where the film does shine, however, is in its depiction of Balian's role during the siege of Jerusalem in 1187. This part of the story is based on real events. After the crushing Crusader defeat at Hattin, Jerusalem was left defenseless. Most knights had either died or been captured. Balian, who had initially been granted safe passage by Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, to retrieve his wife and children from the city, found himself trapped by duty. Despite his oath not to bear arms, he requested Salahuddin's permission to remain, and Salahuddin honorably released him from his vow. Balian then took command of the defense of Jerusalem with a handful of knights, hastily armed civilians and priests, and no hope of reinforcements. He held the city for several days under siege, negotiating with Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, to avoid a massacre. Eventually, he brokered a peaceful surrender, where Christian citizens were allowed to ransom their freedom, a stark contrast to the brutal massacre of Muslims and Jews in 1099. Salahuddin and Balian, respect among rivals. One of the most historically accurate aspects of both the film and history is the mutual respect between Balian and Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu. Though on opposite sides of the siege, both men displayed chivalry, mercy, and a desire to protect civilians from bloodshed. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, admired Balian's courage and integrity. Balian, in turn, respected the Sultan's honor and kept to the terms of surrender. Though not dramatized heavily in medieval sources, the diplomatic outcome of the siege was real. and remarkable. What Kingdom of Heaven got right? Despite its liberties, the film did get several key things mostly right. Baldwin IV's leprosy and tragic reign were accurately portrayed. Reynald of Chatillon's cruelty and provocations against Muslims were correctly depicted. Guy of Lusignan's incompetence as king was dramatized but rooted in truth. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 was presented in the right spirit, as a negotiated surrender, not a bloodbath. The spiritual crisis of the Crusader states, the corruption of their politics, and the futility of constant war, these were captured with nuance. In these elements, Kingdom of Heaven served as a bridge between entertainment and education. What the film got wrong, but many details were twisted for narrative convenience. Balian's background, blacksmith to nobleman, was entirely invented. His romance with Sibylla never happened. The film compresses timelines and simplifies battles like Hattin, showing them out of sequence or ignoring key military realities. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, while portrayed respectfully, is shown mostly in silhouette. His strategic genius and religious motivations are underexplored. The complex religious dynamics between Latin Christians, Eastern Christians, Muslims and Jews are mostly ignored or glossed over. Why the changes? Hollywood's motive. Why did Ridley Scott and his writers change so much? 3 reasons. Emotional storytelling. A blacksmith rising to nobility is a more relatable hero than a born noble. Romantic drama. The Sibylla love story adds tension and gives her character a tragic arc. Modern themes. The film subtly pushes secular humanism, making Balian a character who fights not for religion, but for people. While these choices made for a compelling movie, they do so by flattening the rich religious, political, and spiritual complexities of the time. The real legacy of Balian of Ibelin. After the fall of Jerusalem, the historical Balian continued to play a key role in the Crusader states. He helped negotiate with both Crusaders and Muslims. He supported Queen Isabella's claim to the throne and remained active in the kingdom's politics. His descendants, the Ibelin family, would become important leaders in the Kingdom of Cyprus and the Latin East for generations. Balian was not a one-time hero. He was a statesman, diplomat, and a champion of his people, long after the Hollywood story ends. History is not made by the myths we love, but by the men who lived, led, and chose honor over glory. The real Balian of Ibelin did not need fiction to be remembered. His legacy was carved in courage and sealed with mercy. In the year 1193, in the ancient city of Damascus, the Lion of Islam breathed his last, not on the battlefield, but in the peace of his chamber. The man who had taken back Jerusalem, humbled kings, and redefined chivalry, was gone. Salahuddin's death and eternal legend. Salahuddin Ayyubi, Radiyallahu Anhu, warrior, sultan and unifier, died on March 4, 1193, at the age of 55. He had spent his final years strengthening Muslim unity, distributing his personal wealth to the poor, and ensuring peace among the people he ruled. When his body was prepared for burial, his treasury was nearly empty. Despite ruling over Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and Mesopotamia, he died with barely enough to cover his funeral, because he had given it all away. In charity. Here lies Salahuddin, a poet wrote, who was king of this world, and yet left it with nothing but a shroud. Salahuddin's tomb in Damascus still bears silent witness to his humility. Above it hangs a banner, gifted centuries later by German Emperor Wilhelm II. Even in the West, he became a legend of honor, courage, and restraint. Christian and Muslim perspectives, a shared admiration. To Muslims, Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, was and remains a mujahid, a servant of Allah who defended Islam with sword and wisdom. He is remembered not only for victory, but for his principles, his refusal to massacre civilians, his mercy to enemies, his patience with those who betrayed him. He was a living example of the Quranic command, repel evil with what is better, then the one who hated you may become as close as an intimate friend. Surah Fussilat 41:34. To many Christians, even those who had fought him, Salahuddin was respected as the perfect knight. Richard the Lionheart called him the greatest and most generous of enemies. European chroniclers praised his character even as they mourned their defeats. In later centuries, writers and poets in France and England would speak his name alongside King Arthur and Charlemagne, not as a villain, but a noble rival. In an age of religious warfare, Salahuddin was the bridge between two civilizations, a rare leader admired by both sides. The long-term impact of the Crusades. The Crusades did not end with Salahuddin's death. There would be more. The Fourth Crusade, which shockingly turned against Constantinople, the fifth and sixth, each more desperate than the last. The fall of Acre in 1291, which marked the final loss of Christian Crusader strongholds in the Holy Land. Yet none would match the scale or impact of the Third Crusade or the towering presence of Salahuddin. But the legacy of the Crusades is deeper than battles and castles. Political impact. The Crusades fractured Christian unity, especially between Western Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians. They exposed Europe to the advanced knowledge of the Muslim world, science, medicine, architecture, and philosophy. Cultural exchange. While they came with war, the Crusades unintentionally fueled a renaissance of learning in Europe. Muslim texts, translated into Latin, became foundational in European universities. Islamic world. Muslims saw the Crusades as a wake-up call, a reminder that disunity leads to vulnerability. Leaders like Nur ad-Din Zangi and Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, were products of this era, striving for unity, revival, and justice. Memory and myth. In the West, the Crusades became romanticized epics, tales of knights and chivalry. In the Muslim world, they became symbols of resistance, but also reminders of mercy and moral high ground. Even centuries later, echoes of the Crusades shape our understanding of religious conflict, East versus West narratives, and the importance of mutual respect. Lessons of mercy, justice, and unity. Salahuddin's story, and that of the Crusades, is not just about war. It's about choices made in the face of hatred, about principles held firm when revenge was easy, about unity built not through blood, but through purpose. Mercy over vengeance. Salahuddin, Radiyallahu Anhu, spared tens of thousands of lives in Jerusalem in 1187. He treated prisoners with dignity, even those who had slaughtered Muslims decades earlier. His actions weren't weakness, they were strength guided by faith, justice over corruption. While Crusader lords fought for land, he fought to end oppression and division within the Muslim world. He removed corrupt rulers, even when it cost him politically. He stood not just as a sultan, but as a servant of divine justice, unity over ego. Salahuddin knew that no empire could survive if its people were divided. He brought together Sunnis, Shias, Kurds, Arabs, and Turks under one banner. His greatest strength wasn't his sword, it was his ability to unify hearts. What does his legacy mean today? In a world still plagued by religious divisions, political power games, and cultural misunderstandings, Salahuddin's life offers a mirror and a model. It reminds us that true power lies in restraint, not brutality. Faith must guide action, not justify hatred. Enemies can become allies through dialogue, honor, and patience. Unity is strength, and disunity is always a path to downfall. He was not perfect, No man is, but in his time, Salahuddin Ayyubi, Radiyallahu Anhu, showed that even in war there is room for humanity. He fought with the sword, but ruled with the heart. He conquered cities, but won the respect of empires. And in a world of blood and banners, he stood for justice. Closing words. This was not just the story of a man, a city, or a war. It was the story of a civilization struggling for its soul, of two worlds colliding and sometimes understanding each other, of a time when the sword was sharp, but so was the conscience behind it. Salahuddin's legacy endures, in books, in films, in hearts, not because of how many he defeated, but because of how many he chose not to destroy. Salahuddin Ayyubi, 1137–93. A king who chose mercy over revenge, a warrior who chose peace over pride, a leader whose legend outlived his empire.